tutors. Claudette's case study is featured in the EEDC document. Can you tell us about the workshop you ran at London College of Fashion with participants from the Thomas Pocklington Trust?
Yes, this came across really quite by accident. I met a gentleman who was blind since birth, and he asked me what I could do to teach him something about my job, which hence the project called Seeing is Believing. And within about 20 minutes or so, I taught him how to find the grains on the fabric, and within that very short space of time, he'd pinned a half a toile on the stand and actually had cut the shape that he wanted as well, moved the darts around, and I was absolutely blown away with it. So that started my creative juices going, really. And then just by coincidence again, I had a student who was also visually impaired, but I wasn't told that he was visually impaired when he came onto the programme. I found out quite by accident again, by him playing with his eyes, and I asked him what was wrong, and he explained, and I realised that he just needed to rest his eyes occasionally. And that made me realise that there might be other students out there who are coming onto our courses, and they're probably not always revealing the fact for whatever reason they have. And I think probably at the time it was about 14 students a year that I knew of that was in the college doing various courses with visual impairment. So I thought, I'll look at this further. So I contacted the Thomas Pocklington Trust. They're a charitable organisation who help people with visual impairment and blindness into living independent lives, education, all that sort of information service. So that was really good. And to my surprise, they also found 6 participants for me who were willing to come along and do some trials. And along with the 6 participants, I had 4 alumni who came along and helped me with the project, and I ran a 5-day workshop with them. And the aim was just really to see whether or not they were able to participate on a full-time practical course and to complete that with success. And the object was to ask them to make a waistcoat, and they did that fantastically. They designed the waistcoat themselves, they draped, we had fabrics and they draped those on the stand. We went out and they chose their own fabrics and they came back and they made them up. And some of the participants are actually able to make the garments themselves with reasonable adjustments like correct lighting and magnification to help them, and they did everything themselves. And part of the project also was to see just how independent they could be and what could we put in place to support them, bearing in mind that each person's visual impairment is unique to them. But we could probably set some things up that would help.
What discoveries did you make from running this workshop, and how did it perform in practice?
Made several discoveries, but I'll just mention 2 of them. And one of them was actually zoning the areas. I set about that. That came along because of the need for health and safety. And so had quite a large room, and I set that out for specific things to be done in specific areas, including an area for the seeing dog, and obviously a nice flow, because the people might not familiar yet with the area, with the circumstances in the room. And it just worked so beautifully. No one was bumping into each other. The atmosphere was calm yet really productive. People were just so into it, and I just noticed that was a really good atmosphere to work in. So I took that to a class that I had, which was very, very hectic. Students were working in groups. There were all sorts of emotions flying around and so on. Excuse me. And by zoning that area, it really changed the atmosphere of the class. At first, the students were a little bit reticent, That's the word. My tongue's gone at the moment, and didn't care for it much because they couldn't sit next to their friend. But when they realised that they were actually sitting in groups where the work mattered and it was more productive for them, they really bought into it, and it just changed the atmosphere of the group. And I used that quite a few times now, and I've always had good results with it. So that's something that I will maintain. You know, your environment is so important for production. Another thing I brought into my classroom was I wanted to get the students to connect to the fabric a little bit more, especially new students, and so I blindfolded them, some of them, and I got them to choose fabrics. They learned how to find the grains without having to see the selvage. They learned how to just establish what type of fabric they were using. So we would rub and smell, they would stretch, they would pull, they would try to find the character of the fabric by touch, smell, all of those things, and rather than it being an ocular exercise. And that really kind of helped them to start to connect and to think more multi-sensual rather than always visual.
Can you tell us about the impact of SIB within your own curriculum?
Okay, I took some of the things that I'd learned. So, for instance, when I started, I had to change the way I was speaking to the participants because they didn't use Braille, and so the way I spoke to them, the language that I used, how I described things was really quite important. And I realised that this was a really good way to get them to think more critically, so that was how that impacted. The way they used technology as well was really brilliant. They were all very competent on IT, their own technology that they depended upon. So they had an equipment, for instance, called the CCTV, which is a screen where they could put something underneath to magnify a page or a piece of fabric or something. All those kind of things impacted the classroom. So those things made my classroom inclusive, and the things, whether or not someone's visually impaired, would benefit from. Then I also felt that it was quite important to connect with the students in a personal way, and sometimes I think we're not allowed to touch students or anything like that. When you're working with someone with visual impairment, sometimes it is important to touch with them. So how we connect emotionally was quite important as well. So that kind of impacted on the classroom. With their technology as well, it was like using apps on their phones would be really good because they could see things that's quite close, to have that right there next to them. And also whatever worked for them worked for any student. So I created some videos earlier on for sewing tips, and that also was something that they could access and use, so they didn't always have to go to the teachers. And what I actually found was that the students were very independent, very autonomous, and wanted ownership of their work, and that's something that I pushed more in my classes to try to get them to be more proactive. Bringing technology into a sewing room is always a little bit difficult, but this made it work.
What is the legacy of SIB?
Okay, I did things like going to the V&A and using their touch tools, and I don't know if you've heard of touch tools before.
No.
Okay, so it's a group set up to take people with visual impairment around the museum to look at different installations, and they're it's taught through to them. So we went to see posters at one point, and the person would explain in such depth what the posters meant, the colour, what the paint colours were, what the pigment was, and the paint. And that's something that I would never have learned if I'd just gone along on my own to watch, or would send a student along. So I then also went along to Sadler's Wells and viewed a theatre performance which was able-bodied and disabled people together, and I just observed how their audio description was just so helpful, and the pre-talk they had before the show was so helpful. So I've taken things like that, put that together and come up with things that I can use in my classroom, how I can connect with the students, especially students who are unfamiliar with going to museums, galleries and so on. So it's one of those things that I feel that is brought into the classroom for me that will never leave. So using that multisensory way of connecting and learning and teaching is part of that. I also went to the Alden conference, the 10th conference, and I made a poster of some of the activities we did through this 5-day workshop, and that actually won the prize, so that was really good. But it made me realise that there were people out there who were willing to look at teaching and learning in a different way, and just really embracing the fact that our schools are so much more diverse, and if it opens up that avenue, I'm really, really happy.
In a nutshell, can you sum up SIB?
I think it's been a really inspiring project. It is such an inclusive piece of work. I would have guessed it would have been just slipped into everything so easily. Everything I've discovered is totally inclusive. It's useful for just about the whole of our student population, and I just really want to see that we embrace that. I think that everyone who's come in touch with the project or the students have found very, very positive things coming back from that, and opening up this inclusivity in a multisensual way of teaching and learning is a real buzz for me.